Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. This is another episode of Page Turners Plus. Today, we have a very special discussion program for you. We'll be discussing Marcia Douglas's The Marvelous Equation of the Dread. To tell you a bit more about Marcia Douglas and this novel, we have Paula.
Thank you, Raul J. Marcia Douglas is a Jamaican American novelist and poet. She's a professor of Caribbean literature and creative writing at the University of Colorado, Boulder. The Marvelous Equations of the Dread, a novel in bass riddim, is her third novel. The novel's reggae aesthetic blurs the lines between poetry and prose. Rooted in Rastafari levity, it provokes comparison with Kai Miller's The Cartographer Tries to Map His Way to Zion. For whereas Kai Miller's Rastaman knows the way to Zion because he knows what Zion is, the Bob Marley of the Marvelous Equations of the Dread is less sure-footed. After his death, Bob finds himself in the presence of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, neither knowing what Zion truly is nor how to find it. Bob is a prophet, but he is fallible. He's a soul warrior, but he is wounded. Having been dead for 15 years, Bob returns to Jamaica, transmogrified in the flesh of a fallen angel, to try to retrieve the Lion of Judah ring of His Imperial Majesty. He believes he must do so to fulfill the duty of a faithful son to his spiritual father. But when he arrives in Jamaica, Bob immediately forgets why he has set out on the journey. Ultimately, he will learn that he has been summoned by the people to fulfill a purpose far greater than the one he cannot remember. He will also learn that he must confront his earthly wounds to find his way to Zion.
Thank you very much, Paula. And for those of you who are observant, you might have realized that we're one short today. Francine is unavoidably absent, but we hope to have her back for the next episode. So, to jump right into this, I guess I could ask, is this novel a novel which praises and rebukes Rastafari? I don't know who wants to jump off on that. Any volunteers?
I will.
Yes.
I don't see any rebuke of Rastafari in the novel. I see a novel which praises Rastafari, which is grounded in Rastafari, but a novel which doesn't, I think generally this novel doesn't see anything as sacrosanct. Nothing is above criticism. I think that is the whole tone of this novel, and nothing is beyond questioning. So I see no rebuke. I see questioning, but I see no rebuke.
That's actually a really strong point there, because I think with any religion or any type of culture, you would have aspects that could easily be questioned and that would make the outsider think, this is a little strange, or this is not something that I'm accustomed to. So that is actually a good point, because on my first reading, I thought, this seems like rebuke. But now that you mention it, it may not necessarily be a rebuke of Rastafari, but it's just a questioning or highlighting things.
Mm. Yeah,
If I may, sorry, Eric,
that's okay.
but I just wanted to sort of agree with Paula. And Roger, you are in your first impression, you mentioned that you felt as if it had a tone of rebuke. I didn't get that. I thought it was a very enlightening novel for persons who probably not familiar with Rastafari. It will be interesting to see somebody of a generation. Well, you're young, so we have that generation represented on this panel. But people like Paula and myself, I think, grew up in the height of the foundation of the era that's being defined in this novel. So it more than likely resonates, more vibrantly, if I may risk that, that utterance. But it'll be interesting to see what a young person who I think it's fair to say today may not be as conscious about Rastafari as back in the 70s, 80s, and even extending into the 90s. But I didn't see any rebuke. What I saw was an enlightenment.
Mm. Yeah, critical, definitely critical in a lot of different aspects. I enjoyed the historical groundings. That was just enjoyable. But yes, I think it was critical, but I don't think it was a rebuke of Rastafari. And um, I I'm gonna say that I'm a little bit younger than Tony and Paula, but I do remember I I remember Bob Marley. I remember the music, obviously in the '70s. I was a little kid. I remember when he died, and excuse me. I also remember that there's a Rastafari community in New Orleans. Still is. I know where they hang out. and, natty dreads hang out in a certain section of the city, but I would say that that culture was adjacent to me in the '70s, along with Black Power. Uh, so this book did bring back some childhood memories that I have, and so yeah, I walk away. I would say, Tony, you used the word enlightened, right? I would say that I walked away more enlightened about Rastafari.
Yeah, I just want to add further that what the book did for me was to reawaken that consciousness that felt so much a part of my life when I was in my 20s. And that's really indicative of how diluted maybe it has become. I don't know if it's just me turning a bald head, Paula, but but um, the thing about Eric, you mentioned the Black Power movement and the Rastafarian movement being adjacent. It was almost like one continuum because as that Black Power movement um, started to plateau, the Rastafari movement was the movement that galvanized Black people and sought to dignify us, who we are, embrace ourselves, our hair, this. I think the Rastafari movement actually went deeper to us in the Caribbean than the Black Power movement. And still today is what we hold on to as that ultimate identity as a Black person and its linkage to Africa, the African Messiah. There's so many things going on there that Marcia Douglas brought out in that wonderfully written piece of work.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in and say, I certainly think from a UK context, um, you know, we also have that connection to Rastafari as an organizing kind of community, as a political entity. Certainly when I was very young, if not so much in the same way today. Just to add that small thing.
I think this novel, in a way, is overtly political, but it's not political in the sense, the typical sense that we'd expected. And we've done other novels this year that were written centered in Jamaica, and they were overtly political, but definitely not in the same sense where the the, the bulk of the novel is overtaken by the movement, the Rastafari movement, and their political involvement in Jamaica. And we know at the end of the '60s, especially, there was a widespread marginalization of Rastafari communities in Jamaica. And the fact that this novel is centered mainly on them in Jamaica, I think that's a political statement by Marcia Douglas as well.
Okay, so I would like to ask you, with the person with the English, well, that's where you live now, okay? Because a lot of this novel touched on the significance of that migration that Jamaicans took to the UK, and to be fair, I believe the scene in England, London, to be more specific at the time, provided a platform for the music, which is the anthems or the anthems of Rastafari. I think that provided a platform to get the music out there. And I believe that that's where the fertilization took place. And that's how it permeated through in a global sense, right? So I think London played a very critical part in this whole link, and I believe Marcia Douglas was dealing with that as well, in how she stitched together the novel.
Well, it's funny you should say that. I mean, just this week, I had the good fortune to go and watch the Get Up Stand Up musical, which is playing in London at the moment. It's a kind of a biography of Bob Marley, with the background of all his music, and it does deal with his time in the UK, and his own kind of personal journey. And through it, I think I say that because I think that it's in the West End of London. It's a great musical. The music is fantastic. It's all live. And I think it's been insanely popular. And part of that is because there is a strong Caribbean community in the UK, that's come out to support it, but also because of the influence of the music that has its global kind of that's made Bob Marley a global superstar. Means that all sorts of people are coming to see it as well. If you go sort of half an hour before it shows, the queues around that theatre are insane. Like, it's wildly popular. And I do think so I think you mentioned the kind of space of London as a space of spreading of the movement. I think it's because the earlier generation of Caribbean migrants, so the kind of very first 1950s era, their children often are sort of the 20 years later group, and those are the ones that Bob Marley moves with. Those are the ones that are that kind of adopt Rastafari as a kind of as a cultural, political response to the racism that they're facing in the UK, right? And they're the ones who are also fighting racism in a different sort of way. So in the early days, you have to fight almost physically on the streets because you're being attacked in gangs. And that's just a reality that Black people in the UK are facing, when the first generation of Caribbean migrants, in the sense, as a historian, I have to rephrase that. The first generation of this mass post-war migration is what I'm trying to say. And their children are less willing to be accepted as outsiders. The first, we always think of this kind of first generation of this first post-war generation of migrants as being temporary, but ended up staying. Whereas their children are British, feel they have a right to the society. I mean, their parents were too, right? But they feel like a much stronger sense of they can't be denied their rights in quite the same way. They're not foreigners. They have the same accent. They went to the same schools. I don't think I'm answering your question very well at all. Do I think London is a special place in that sense? Yes, but it's not only London, because I think there are other cities in the UK where also this kind of pollination of ideas is happening. There is a small Black Power movement. There is a Black liberation movement globally that Black people politically in the UK have tapped into. And Rastafari is a organising cultural response, I think, for a lot of people. We see my name.
I was just trying to contrast I use London as the focal point, but England in general. Well, I was just trying to contrast it with, say, Eric, you in the United States would not have had the same energy around Rastafari as but it wasn't just Bob Marley. There were people before Bob Marley on the music scene as well. And reggae had a huge root in London, England, right?
I feel like I'm not qualified to talk about music history in the same way anymore.
Well, I can point out that in the United States, it was actually Boston. Boston, for some reason, that was the place where the United States got introduced to reggae. I mean, there was small, a growing Caribbean community in Boston in the 1960s, and that was the place. But also just up the road from Boston, in Toronto. So yeah, there were these North American enclaves. But I think I would agree with you, Tony, that in the United States, Rastafari was. I mean, we knew about it, especially in like chocolate cities like New Orleans or Washington D.C. We knew about it. We saw Rastas, uh, but and Bob Marley. I think Bob Marley became more popular after his death in the United States than when he was alive. I didn't start buying his stuff until I was in college in the '80s. Knew about him, but I think our consciousness was raised. Those of us who are from his generation in the '80s, especially I think with the release of Legend, um, so Bob Marley was and other artists, Peter Tosh and others that we gravitated to.
Yeah, I guess I forgot about Steel Pulse, which is a terrible thing to admit. But they were from Birmingham, right? Round the corner in Handsworth. Absolutely, or you're not so much a UK oriented, but Marcus Garvey's Ghost, Burning Spear. So so there's a whole cultural movement that definitely Caribbean communities in the UK are absolutely plugged into, and it's very much shaping how we understand ourselves. Definitely.
But the proportion of the novel dedicated to Bob being in the diaspora compared to being in Jamaica is quite minute in my opinion. And even in terms of his companion, I could call him, who returned to go to the University of the West Indies, Mona. So I'm wondering if that shows that there's a sort of love-hate relationship with Jamaica. Do you think that was suggested in the novel? Do you think it weighs more heavily in favor of love or more heavily in favor of hate? Paula, you're smiling.
I don't see any hate at all. What I see is a deep, abiding love, which is accompanied by anxiety. Um, it's a kind of love you have for a family member who you think is going down the wrong path. So you're constantly anxious, but the anxiety doesn't diminish the love. So what you're trying to do is talk them out of going down that path. I don't see hate at all. I see abiding love.
Yeah, I
Paula,
absolutely second that.
yeah, I just sort of second guessing Royal G. Marcia Douglas in this novel refers to, and Bob Marley has it in the lyrics of one of his songs too. A good man is never honored in his own land, right? I don't know if that's the direction Royal J was taking, but um, I think there was some sort of, reference there to that love hate thing that Roger may have been getting at. I don't know if I'm second guessing you right, Roger, but she did play with that, Paula, several times. And I sort of wondered what the significance was. Was it that she was talking about Haile Selassie being the second coming of Christ, but not being recognized as that? I don't know why she was playing a lot with those lyrics that Bob had in
Let
his
me tell you
song.
why I think that this cannot be conceived as any kind of hate of Jamaica. In the beginning of the novel, before the novel even begins, um, in the give thanks portion, she says one of the things she gives thanks to is Jamaica, and she describes it as dread and powerful. Now, dread in Ayaric or dread talk is never a bad word. Dread is a good word. The fact that she describes Jamaica as dread and powerful says a huge amount. Then, when the novel begins, the first character we see is Taino Woman. And Taino Woman sees the three ships coming towards Jamaica. She sees the man with hair the color of papaya. And she says, we're put into Taino Woman's head, and she says, he thinks he can take her Jamaica, land of wood and sweet river water. But this land is stubborn and will not be moved. I don't know how you could have a more robust declaration of love than that. I don't see any hate. I see the anxiety of maybe, the kind of anxiety, say, a mother has for a child. Um, but certainly I don't see how it could be interpreted as anything but love.
Yeah,
Mm.
I agree with you. I mean, I think it's the anxiety more than, well, not more than hate. I just don't see any hate myself.
Yeah, I did see it as well, I do see it as a criticism of colonialism and the legacies of colonialism, and uh, how that has shaped, let's say, the late '70s, early '80s, uh, and then as time goes on, in the text, I think there's one character in particular where I think that anti-colonialism really is shown, at least is in my eyes, and that's the figure of with the six, with the seven. I don't know those English monarchs, but uh, really the one that was the clock tower was dedicated to. So uh, if anything, I wouldn't say there's no hatred toward Jamaica, because to say that would be hatred toward people. Jamaica is the people.
It's Edward the Seventh. I don't know monarchs either, but I tried to remember him just for the purpose of the book. Otherwise, I'm quite happy to forget all of them.
And that if we could go on, as Eric brought it up, the clock tower. That's obviously a central part of where all these spirits met. Um, the significance, Paula, of Halfway Tree Road, the cotton tree, and what cotton means to us in the Caribbean, and that symbol of the colonial past and the brutality and the atrocities, the hanging, you know, Third World actually, which is was a contemporary group then as well in the times that we're talking about. In that song, 96 Degrees in the Shade, mentions that hanging, you know, under the cotton tree. And as a Jamaican, Paul, I think maybe you can enlighten us a bit more as to I don't know, the historical significance of Halfway Tree Road, that cotton tree that keeps coming up with its roots running through the whole of Jamaica by now. Um,
Running through the
yeah.
whole of Jamaica in the novel. Actually, the silk cotton tree in Halfway Tree, as I think Marcia mentions it in the beginning of the novel, that the silk cotton tree was cut down to make way for the clock, for the erection of the clock, which was to honor Edward the Seventh. Now, the silk cotton has significance in Jamaican folklore. A silk cotton tree is not, it's not cotton like that they used to grow in the south, or even in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, to create clothing. A silk cotton tree is a ceiba tree. And in Jamaican folklore, a silk cotton tree is a home for the ancestors. Duppy live in silk cotton tree. Every good Jamaican knows that Duppy live in silk cotton trees. And they're enormous, so they're very imposing. It looks like something somewhere where a Duppy would live, where several Duppies would live. They're huge, huge, huge things. And the novel starts, well, I don't know if it starts off. Probably doesn't start off. But a very important event in the novel is the cutting down of the silk cotton tree to make way for the clock, which honors this colonial king. And of course, just the thought of that does so much violence to your head. So I think it's a good way to set up the novel. I probably am not answering Tony's question.
No,
But
I
another
was,
significant thing
yeah.
about Halfway Tree. Halfway Tree, we've spoken before about classes in Jamaica and how separate the classes are in Jamaica. Halfway Tree is considered the meeting point of uptown and downtown. It's where uptown and downtown intersect. So everybody eventually, whether you're from uptown or downtown, you meet in Halfway Tree. It's a major shopping center. It's a major commercial district, in fact. So everybody, it's a hub for the whole of Kingston. So I think it has, I suspect that it had that kind of significance as well. That is why the Marcia decided to center Bob and our colonial past in the form of Edward the Seventh, to whom the clock is dedicated, in Halfway Tree, and particularly in that clock. And the fact that the clock never works, and I have checked recently, I have gone onto YouTube where you can see live video of Halfway Tree and the clock is still not working. So that of course is very symbolic. That the cotton tree is cut down to make way for this clock, which never works, which is broken. Always broken. Hugely symbolic.
Well, it's Haile Selassie's spirit and Bob Marley's spirit, and I was going to ask you, the boy who was hanged on the cotton tree.
I think that is an invention of Marcia's. The 96 degrees that you're thinking about, Tony, is actually about Paul Bogle. It's about the Morant Bay Rebellion. Yeah. So it's not at all something that's centered in Kingston.
So they're not connected.
No, they're not.
Right. So that invention of Marcia with the youngster who died with a word on his tongue, but we never get to know what it is.
That's I think he's just there for symbolic reasons. He's not meant to be real. Can I
ask a question? No, speak just as kind of riffing off your discussion about the character. So one of the things I really liked about the book is the way it draws in such a wide number of characters. Some of them are real, some of them are fiction, as you were kind of discussing, which is why the question popped into my head. And I just wondered, were there any characters who appeared that surprised people?
Well, Kesua, before we get into that, as you mentioned characters, I think this would be a really good time for our listeners and viewers to see and hear Marcia Douglas in action, reading from a section of this beautiful novel.
Hello, I am Marcia Douglas, and I am reading from the Marvellous Equations of the Dread. I'm going to share a short passage for you from the section Rastaman on the Run. And just to set this up a little bit, in this scene, Bob Marley has entered into a spirit yard with many other characters who have likewise returned from the dead. We need a plan, Nanny says. Something great, same as we imagine we nation, yet simple as a goat's milk. That's how the Maroons defeated the enemy. Who would have believed that we could defeat the British with a few roots and river stones and so-so weeds? A woman dressed in white beats a drum between her knees. 3 times 3, tears run down her face. Her lips tremble. 3 times 3. Her hands call, sound uprising, and skin deliverance. But how shall we start? The drums stop. The woman falls to the ground, her body shaking. Someone sprinkles her with white rum. She lets out a sigh, and everyone is quiet. With the children, Bob says. He steps forward into the circle, still wet from storm. My name is Robert Nesta Marley. I man used to play music, but before that me was a boy, had a pain in my heart. My heart's so heavy, it beat with a one drop, one drop. Is music and Rastafari save me, but everyone don't so lucky. The youth them, me hear them bawl at night outside in the road, and when them eye water dry up, them beat them one another. Is them we must start with one mighty force, calls Garvey. The little youth shall lead us. One by one we must build an army. Selah. Somewhere a lizard begins to sing. The young girl Hortense rises up and Bob gives her the drum. Her small hands beat the skin, chanting down Babylon. The spirits sing Nyabingi and Nanny dances in the circle. She grasps the hem of her skirt as her feet inch the ground, working the perimeter. There is a scent of white rum and a swirl of mango leaf and bird feather. And this is how the drums speak. Zion train coming, Zion train coming. People get ready, Zion train coming. Zion is a place inside, calls Garvey. And this is what the drums speak. Set the children free, set the children free, set the children free. Patsy zips up her boots and dances with Nanny in the circle. Who can't clap, sing? Who can't sing, clap? Who can't testify, dance, she calls. Her feet dip and part, dip and part. A drought travels her spine and rises to her head. It pushes at the space between her scalp and funeral wig. She closes her eyes and whispers, rah. For this is what the drums speak. Zion train coming, Zion train coming. Children get ready, Zion train coming. And the woman with the furious plait begins to cry, for she sees her great-grands far, far on the other side. They have her guinea cheekbones and ashy skin. Zion is a place inside, she calls, hoping they will hear. And her bare feet dance the words into the dust of the dirt road. Zion is, her heels treading faster. Zion is, go the drums. And spirit feet massage the ground. But this is the real reason there are almost 200 little earthquakes on the island per year. And why you should pay attention when the photo on the living room wall shifts sideways, your feet unsteady in the hallway. For this is how the long dead rock our fever babies or shake the youth from don't care.
So, Kesua, just before we took the reading, you were talking about our favorite characters. Would anyone like to talk about their favorite characters and why? And
I don't think Kesawa was asking about favorite characters. Kesawa asked whether any character surprised us. And I'd like to answer that question. Meherene, she surprised me. The lady who started off as a maid, a chambermaid to Haile Selassie and became his lover. I was impressed that Marcia went there. What I find about the novel, I find it how it treats sexuality very interesting. Throughout the novel, I think Marcia suggests that sexuality should not be closed in all kinds of mystery, that it's normal. And I think that is why she chose to show His Imperial Majesty as a sexual being. I thought it was risky, but I was fascinated by it. And another thing too about sexuality is she shows the relationship between Bob and Lena, which in my mind never actually turned into something sexual, even though it was always going there. I don't know. I can see that I can see how you could interpret that it was sexual. I thought it was going there, but Lena wouldn't allow it to actually be consummated. And also, speaking of sexuality again, Negus, who is fall down, the fallen angel whose body Bob inhabits when he comes back to Jamaica after his death. Negus is an angel whose job it is to create opportunities for sexual activity. So all of that is really something fascinating.
Yeah, that section there, well, those allusions with niggas, reminded me of Renee Depestre's Hadrona and All Her Dreams, where there's a similar figure, not in Fallen Angel, but uh, and I can't remember all the details. I read the book almost a year ago, but it was this person or spirit that became like an insect and he was impregnating people. It's just wild because that novel is borderline eroticism, but it definitely reminded me of that. And yeah, I mean that was risky. I do agree. I was risky to have Haile Selassie um, as a sexual. I mean, depicting him as a sexual person, but we're all sexual, so I
I
was
don't know.
comfortable with it.
I didn't find it so risky because if you really look at the lineage of um, Rastafari, Haile Selassie, when we go back to Solomon, um, and we start to, and she does set the tone. Solomon and his many wives. I mean, this is a defining thing about Rastafari as well, because that's embedded in their thinking. They're not necessarily, well, I don't want to commit myself here with the statement, so let me just pull up. But they certainly go forth and multiply, right? And read what you want in between that. Um, so Paula, I really didn't
There's a
see.
stereotype, Tony.
No, you think so? Because I didn't see um any separation between what we expected of Haile Selassie and Bob Marley as well, because Bob Marley was portrayed as somebody who liked women. I mean, there was no covering that up in the novel. So, and I thought that Marcy is just saying, look, this is an accepted norm. Use this stereotype. I say it's an accepted norm.
I kind of posed the question slightly because I loved the references to historical figures that kind of popped up, and all kinds of historical figures from all, well, not all kinds, but a wide range of historical figures that don't necessarily all get space in the same spaces actually a lot of the time. And I was particularly enamored is exactly the right word, because I just thought, wow, that was fantastic. When Marcus Garvey no, not Marcus Garvey rebukes, where I think Bob Marley rebukes Marcus Garvey for having called Haile Selassie a coward, which is a real thing that happened back in the 1930s, and my little historian's head was like, woo! But also the way it was done in the book was marvelous.
Oh
No
yeah,
pun intended.
loved it, loved the appearance of Marcus Garvey. I thought he cemented the dialogue, and the thoughts that Bob Marley was having, and the question that he asked even of Haile Selassie. But yeah, Garvey in there, yes. I mean, because I, I mean, I would argue that part of the movement is rooted in Garvey's philosophy, and Garvey himself. I think Garvey is recognized as a prophet. Am I correct on that?
Yes, you are. Yeah. Um, yeah, but to get back, Tony, to why I think it's risky, I don't believe that this novel challenges in any serious way um, the divinity of His Imperial Majesty. Um, it's I believe that the novel doesn't really dispute that, dispute the divinity of His Imperial Majesty. His Imperial Majesty is not presented in the way that the Judeo-Christian God is presented. He is not presented as infallible. But I think this whole novel suggests to me that infallibility is not something that is necessary in order for somebody to be great or even good. I think that is a strong message that this novel presents, that you needn't be infallible to be a great person. Speaking of Bob, His Imperial Majesty in the novel says, even great persons, I can't remember the exact quote, sometimes they don't learn as fast as they should. But you know, so I that is a theme I see running through the novel, that goodness and greatness are, infallibility is not a requirement, because it speaks about not only Bob's failings, not only His Imperial Majesty's weaknesses. We already mentioned Marcus Garvey. It seriously challenges, Bob seriously challenges Marcus Garvey on that issue of his pronouncement on his Imperial Majesty. So yeah.
And not only that, others challenge Marcus Garvey as well. And I think it's interesting that she chooses sometimes women to bring out as characters to highlight the weaknesses of the men, as you've mentioned, you know, because we're talking at something of a triumvirate of major figures, right? Marcus Garvey, Bob Marley, and Haile Selassie. But each of them is not, I don't want to say brought down by a woman, that's not what I mean, but each of them has interaction.
I remember what I think I remember what you're referring to, Kesawa, where the dance hall queen Patsy challenges Marcus Garvey. She says, too much preaching. There's too much preaching. And he agrees with her.
Sorry, go ahead. No, but at the same time, the irony of that is, of course, she's like, what we need is to go back to Africa. So there's also a lack of kind of understanding about who you're attacking, right?
Not really, because Marcus Garvey, I think Marcus Garvey in the novel, he agrees that the go back to Africa message that he was putting forward is no longer necessary, because one of the things he says is that we need to go back to Africa in our minds. You know, speaking of Rastafari, because Rastafari is so important to this book, one of the things Rastafarians often say is Africa was born in us. And it's a phrase that I love so much, because I don't have to be born in Africa to claim my Africanness. It's born in me. And I think it's a similar message that Marcus Garvey is modifying his message in the novel. He is suggesting that the going back to Africa is something we need to do in our minds, just as the search for Zion is something that it has to be done in our minds. It's not a physical place that we need to go to, right? And that the novel says that very, very clearly, that it's in our minds.
Well,
And Peter Tosh captures that Africanness in one of his songs. I can't remember the name of the song, but it's no matter where you come from, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. That you know, you just reminded me of that, and I think that's what Peter Tosh was also capturing. It's born in you. You're black, you're African. You don't have to be going back to Africa or born in Africa to prove that you're an African. So I think that's a fair point, Paula.
Here. That's what I preach. You know, and I don't think I can preach that enough in my teaching and my scholarship. But there is one character that goes to Africa. We haven't mentioned him yet. Actually, yeah, there's one, and I think he's an important character, even though he doesn't get a lot of time. But I think he's really, really important.
Riverman? That's who you're
Yes,
referring to? Yes.
yes.
Yeah. So tell me, Eric, why do you think he is such an important character? I'm curious.
I think he's important because of his role, uh, his his role as like a sweeper, um, in and around Haile Selassie's apartment, and in the apartment, and he works in proximity to the chambermaid Meheran, uh, and he knows what's going on, but he chooses to remain silent, and he's accepting of certain things. So I think your point before, Paula, about the unnecessary quality of infallibility, I think is reflected in his, let's call them actions, even though he chooses to remain silent, and he was almost blamed for being like a rat. But he didn't see it on outside. He didn't seem like he knew what was going on, but really he did. He knew exactly what was going on. So he was really attentive. Um, and that was a key moment in the history of Ethiopia that she places him in. So I thought that was creative and very imaginative.
It was, and I feel like we're forgetting to mention that Bob returned to Jamaica as Fall Down, and not necessarily that he returned to the homeland in Ethiopia, but he returned to Jamaica as Fall Down. Do you think that was an appropriate way for Marcia Douglas to characterize the sort of return?
I think it gives her a lot to work with. I think it's a good uh, narrative technique to have Bob transmogrified into the body of one, a fallen angel, two, a man who is perceived as a madman, three, a man who is a rival for a woman that Bob is in love with. It gives her, it's a wonderful technique. It gives her so much to work with. So she can invite her readers to question whether what we perceive as madness is in fact madness. We can, it gives her, it just gives her a lot of opportunities. She gets an opportunity to speak about reality, whether how we perceive reality. That the, is this the only this sphere that we live in now? Is this the only reality there is? Because I think the novel suggests that there are other realities, that there are other realms, spiritual realms that are just as real as the realm in which we live in. So I just think it's a really good narrative technique to have created this character.
And I mean, it was quite, at first it was really fascinating that that she brought him back as a quote unquote madman, because these are people who are ostracized in society, and she demonstrated that, because when he went to different places, different houses, and he was sort of like ignored or laughed at and so on, and even though he was technically Bob and people didn't see that, I think that demonstrated a really powerful point, that these are people um, who are ostracized in society, but maybe he wasn't so different to Bob other than he wasn't famous. you know?
Quite frankly, I don't know if it taught me anything, because if I were to see a man who doesn't look like Bob coming up to me and saying, "It's me, Bob," I would laugh too. I would have been. I remember one of the first scenes was when the policeman saw him in front of 56 Hope Road. And he said, "It's me, Bob. I looking for Rita." And the policeman laughs and drives off. I would have reacted exactly the same way. So I don't know if this novel helped cure me of any of my prejudices.
But it's also a play on that whole thing about returning is also, to me, I don't know if I'm going too deep, but it's also that religious thread of the I'm not saying Bob is a third coming of Christ, but it's this whole idea that these people return, and when they return, you won't recognize them. you just won't, so I think that was also going on in that.
And it's something the character grapples with, right? Because he then says, maybe if I talked to her about things that only she and I would know about, she would recognize me. But if you just say I'm Bob, no, of course anyone could say that. He's a famous person. Literally anyone could say that. But he needs to speak in a language that only they shared, so that she would know that actually it really was him in a different body.
But as I just want to roll back a bit, because we were talking about those who the one character, the Riverman, who went to Africa. But there's also another character in the book who I think it's Lena's grandfather, who disappeared for all intents and purposes. But his main ambition was the Marcus Garvey call to go back to Africa. So there was some significance there, I feel, in making that point. Certainly at that stage in the novel. I want to throw out a question as well. As we're talking about Lena's grandfather, that whole coming across from Cuba. I was kind of trying to see what was the significance of the linkages there, Paula. I don't know if I was trying
Could
to
I
read,
try and take that
too
one?
much.
Well, Kessa wants to take that on because I really have no clue.
Well, isn't it because in the 1930s you have a huge return of Jamaicans expelled, not just Jamaicans either, people expelled from Cuba because of the sugar crisis there, if I remember correctly, the history. Eric, correct me if I'm wrong here. And so you do have this, and so a lot of the time we think about the labor rebellions in the 1930s, people say that people who've been in Cuba were a big part of it, and obviously, and not obviously, but also Cuba was a big center for UNIA activity. A lot of Caribbean people of Anglophone descent from the British-speaking Caribbean who had migrated to Cuba had been a big part of the Garvey movement in Cuba, and so they're very organized, they're very active politically, and then they returned to the English-speaking Caribbean around the time of the labor rebellions, preceding it somewhat. So I think I think one of the things that is marvelous again about the book is the way she draws these kind of real histories and then kind of fictionalizes them and turns them around. And I think my question was on a similar note. My last question was, do we think that it's dangerous what she does because she's taking real histories and mixing them up with these stories, or is it exciting because she obviously knows the history clearly, so she can play around with it in a way that, when you know the rules you can mix them up, but if you don't know the history, is it going to be confusing? And I say dangerous, I'm being facetious a little bit. I think it's great because she's using all these different historical fixes, all these things that really did happen, mix them with things that didn't happen, and asking us, I think, to figure out what's going on. Where do we go from here, type thing. And she does it all, I think, as Paul said at the beginning, from a space of love for Jamaica, right? She's kind of trying to throw all the possible solutions out. But is it okay that she doesn't always point to historical facts? She doesn't reference. She's not saying read this book for more information. She's just kind of telling you her version.
And in answering this, we could also give our final thoughts of the novel. So, Tony?
Well, I was going to say, guess what? That's what I really liked about the novel. I read it almost like a student of Marcia Douglas. It's almost as if she was lecturing me. So she opened a lot of facets of my mind to do some historical research. The bits that I lived through was refreshing, because of my age and the generation that she was dealing with. So that was refreshing. The book appealed to me on many aspects, Roger. If you want my final thoughts, it's definitely something I can't rate under a 5, 5 being the maximum. And I just immersed myself into her rhythm. And a book written in bass could not be more aptly described, to be honest. And I was pleasantly surprised. I was a little apprehensive at first. Am I going to really get into this? But I was in it, man, from the word go. So yes, Roger, it's a 5 for me, and it's a novel that I enjoy.
All right, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, the historical references were just great, and I had no problems with the interspersing of people like Bob Marley's father. into putting him in the same space with Marcus Garvey, but at a different time in the clock tower, and that section had me laughing. The chant, I'm a coward, I'm a white coward, I'm a white Jamaican coward. I mean, I didn't laugh, didn't laugh, didn't laugh. So no, I love that about the text. So overall, I mean, I rated a 4. Um, it did take me some time to really get into it, and maybe that was because I was doing other stuff and reading other stuff at the same time. But um, once I got rolling, yes, the rhythm took me, swept me away.
No, Katsu, I knew you threw out the question, but you could also get in there.
I can't even remember my own question now, so I'll just go with the rating. um, oh, it's about how the history thing. Yeah, I'm not sure the answer. That's why I asked the question. Really. Final thought question. I really loved the interspersing of history and fiction. It's something that I think is beautifully done in the novel. I struggled to get into it a little bit. It took me by surprise. I wasn't sure I liked how she handled disability in the deaf character, if I'm completely honest. And so for that reason, I'm going to give it a 4. But it's incredibly creative as a novel. I think it definitely requires several readings, and it will be going on my students' historical fiction from the Caribbean list, which is always a good thing. I mean, which just means I think it's great. I just personally am still grappling with it. But intensely valuable as a teaching tool, certainly, and enjoyable. I also laughed incredibly, intensely when and I was choking laughing with the children's scene. The way she writes the kids, I was crying, absolutely crying. So it's a 4 for me. Thank you, Marcia, for writing this.
Yeah, and for me, I definitely loved the way she interwove the history and gave her own version of events and her own style to things. That was definitely beautiful.
We need
And
Paula's rating too, Roger.
oh, oh,
I see you're trying to wrap up the program, but we
no,
have to hear from Paula.
I am definitely not wrapping up the program because I'm leaving Paula for last for a very special reason. But I definitely loved it. I give it a 4.5. I'll upgrade it to a 4.5 out of 5. Paula?
This is one of my favorite novels of all time. My rating is infinity out of 5. Um, when Kesawa was having some problems getting into it, I wrote a note to the group to say that you have to surrender yourself to this novel, the way you surrender yourself to poetry. Just let the rhythm, just let the ride on the wave of the rhythm. Ride the rhythm. That's how you have to enjoy this this book. Don't try to analyze every sentence. Just write it. Just write it. Eventually, it will come together. This is one of the most amazing novels I've ever read in my life, and I've read a lot of novels. That's it for me.
Tony, you see why I left her for last? There was a reason. Thank you very much for joining in another episode of Page Turners Plus. This was our reflections on Marcia Douglas's The Marvellous Equations of the Dread. The next time you see us, we'll be interviewing Marcia Douglas. Thank you for joining us. Have a lovely day.